Okay. Oh, hi, sorry. Well, welcome to Scotland in 7. This is Gordon Ross. Sorry, you caught us unaware there. We're having a little chat there. Okay, welcome to the show. My guest this evening is MSP Tom Arthur, who is the MSP for Renfrewshire South. Welcome, Tom. Thank you for being a guest this evening.
Pleasure to be here.
Forgive me for the slightly chaotic beginning. I had to run into the studio after a big traffic jam this evening. So we're here to talk about the main stories that are taking place at the moment, and probably one of the biggest ones just now is the whole idea of the no-deal Brexit and whether it can be stopped or not. And we're hearing today from the news feeds that, according to Philip Hammond, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, he believes that it is possible to prevent Boris Johnson from taking us out of the European Union without a deal. What is your response to this? Do you think this is possible, or is he just clutching at straws here?
I read the piece from Philip Hammond in the Times this morning. I'm smiling, and I shouldn't be, because it's not a laughing matter, but there is some grand irony that this whole exercise of Brexit, which was about restoring the sovereignty of the British Parliament, taking back control, and the debate now seems to be about whether the Parliament should be able to stop this or permit this or change the nature of Brexit at all, which suggests it never really was about taking back control in the first place. I think it's alarming that we're now in this situation where we're a matter of weeks away from the UK crashing out of the European Union without a deal. And if we remember the advice that the UK government was given back at the end of March and the beginning of April, was use this time wisely. And where have we got to? We're now getting into a debate which we sort of thought had been settled in the 17th century in England between the powers of Parliament and the executive, and it's been rekindled. I think that the question about whether a no-deal Brexit can be stopped, I think, goes beyond Parliament. It comes down to a question of popular consent. I think there's been suggestion, perhaps, for example, were there to be a no-deal Brexit on the 31st of October, followed immediately by an election where a new administration was to come to power in the UK, that the EU might be amenable to effectively being able to and readmit the UK at short notice. That was one comment I read recently.
So the idea of sort of coming out and then diving straight back in again.
This is the absurd situation that we're in now. And I think it comes back to the fundamental issue with the whole Brexit process, which is that the question that was put was one of leaving. It wasn't one of destination. And there's still no clarity in what the destination is. That for those devout Brexiteers who now sit round the cabinet table in Downing Street, where is it they want to go? What is their vision for the UK? Now, I can go on as someone who voted Remain, who wants the whole of the UK to stay within the European Union, and who absolutely wants Scotland's vote to stay in the European Union to be recognised. I've made my argument, my colleagues have made their arguments to be blue in the face about why Brexit is a bad idea. But what's becoming clear is that it's not just the occasional fringe Brexiteer who's unable to put forward the arguments for why they want Brexit and what the destination is supposed to be. It's the very heart of government. And it fundamentally comes back to is they don't know what the destination is, what the purpose of Brexit is. I don't know. We often perhaps see maybe in a sort of a LBC James O'Brien phone in when he tries desperately and earnestly to engage with someone who's called in who voted Brexit to find out what the motivations are. But he may as well be having a conversation with Boris Johnson or Dominic Raab.
And of course everybody who phones up has a completely different reason for why they wanted Brexit, and often a different view of what the destination should actually be. Yeah. Nobody seems to be able to agree.
So there's that, and I think that comes down comes to the heart of it, and it's the point that Philip Hammond made, is that he voted 3 times for the Prime Minister's deal to leave the European Union. It's strange that he and others are being characterised by Boris Johnson, I believe, as collaborators, when they are the people who ultimately have put together a set of arrangements which would see a very hard Brexit take place. And yet they're the ones who've been accused of conspiring to stop the UK from leaving the European Union. It is such an absurd set of circumstances.
Well,
so from that particular scenario to the fact there's now machinations by the government and Dominic Cummings to try and circumvent parliamentary sovereignty, it speaks to the absurd nature of this entire process.
Do you think, I got the feeling, and this is my own take on this, that when Philip Hammond and Theresa May came up with this deal, when they actually sat down with the European Union and negotiated this, with those red lines, those limitations on what could and could not be done, they knew very well that what they were going to come back with was going to be an unpalatable dog's dinner. And I got the impression at the time that both May and Hammond wanted to do this to show the public what exactly they had voted for. This is what you get if you leave the European Union, with the red lines that you have set. I got the feeling they were trying to teach them a lesson almost. I don't know if you got the same impression.
Well, it was you can have your dog's dinner and eat it. It's a scenario that's prevailed. It's an interesting theory, but ultimately what the deal that was negotiated was, and ultimately the consequence of those red lines that the Prime Minister set out. And if one, setting aside my own views on Brexit and why I'm against it, to go and just try and look at it and analyse the whole way in which the Prime Minister conducted these negotiations independently, it was riddled, the former Prime Minister, I should say, it was riddled with flaws from the start. Firstly, there was interpreting what was a very narrow vote at a UK-wide level for the hardest form of Brexit. Mm-hmm. Then there was playing to the gallery at Tory conference in autumn 2016 with we'll be leaving the customs union, we'll be leaving the single market. Well, that was still to come. We were still to graduate to that particular level of absurdity. But there was that particular element, and then there was the Lancaster House where this was, these red lines were fully cemented. And then there was what the Prime Minister, the one card that the Prime Minister going into these negotiations had to play was triggering Article 50. It was to be her decision when that was triggered, and that gave her a tremendous amount of leverage, because clearly the European Union would have been conscious of the clock ticking, of elections in a couple of years' time as it was, and of wanting to move on from this.
So it should have accelerated the negotiation process.
There was in terms of our whole negotiating strategy, it was flawed, but it comes back fundamentally to the issue that there wasn't actually a clear mandate for what Brexit is. One of the and I think perhaps, the most damaging legacy, certainly one of them from Prime Minister Theresa May, was the normalisation of a no-deal Brexit. No deal is better than a bad deal, which was repeated mantra-like week in, week out. And this idea of a no-deal Brexit, which would be an economic and social calamity for the UK, and damaging for Europe and particularly for Ireland as well, this was normalised, and this was never a position that was put forward or really seriously entertained by the Leave campaign.
But it was also a sort of paradoxical tautology that nothing is better than something. It just didn't make any sense at all, even when you said it thousands of times, that no deal was better than a bad deal. But who decides what a bad deal is? If you've made as we know, they made the conditions that led to the bad deal themselves and created the bad deal. So that means what? That means that they want a no deal, because otherwise they wouldn't have created a bad deal in the first place.
It is. But there was an opportunity there to recognise the close nature of the result, to recognise that many senior figures in the Leave campaign had spoke about a very close and a thoroughly integrated deal with the European Union. Many had spoken about continued membership of the single market and customs union. That was what the general tone was like, as I recall it, from the Leave campaign. Their argument was about withdrawing from some of the political institutions and gaining some marginal autonomy in other areas. There was a debate to go and be had there. I don't see what the point of it is. But ultimately what it comes down to is that it comes down to the fundamental paradox of the whole Brexit question, which is that you avoid you try to minimise economic dislocation by having a very close relationship with Europe, but ultimately you gain very little, if any, autonomy and lose your seat at the decision-making table. Or the converse is that you gain very marginal autonomy, degrees of autonomy in some areas, but you suffer a huge economic hit for that. So it was never, these issues were never properly, fully explored. And then what's become really the sort of fundamental issue, the defining issue of this whole process, is the border on the island of Ireland. And the backstop was barely mentioned by the Leave campaign, despite wiser heads warning that this would be an issue. And fundamentally, just as there was never a willingness to address these questions in the actual campaign, there's not been a willingness to address the campaign, these questions in the last 3 years.
Well, if I might interrupt just for a moment, just to pick up on something you said there about the backstop. The backstop is a guarantee that the British government will see to it that there is no hard border if they haven't got a deal agreed. Mm-hmm. So the backstop was basically the European Union telling the United Kingdom that they would exit in an orderly fashion, but they would be expected after that to come up with a plan to solve the problems of a frictionless border. And we're hearing today from the American Congress, from Nancy Pelosi, who is the Speaker of the House of Representatives in the United States, saying that there is no way that the House, in fact, either House of the House of Representatives or the Senate would back giving the UK a deal if it broke the Good Friday Agreement. Because America had obviously invested a great deal in brokering or helping to broker that peace deal between the Irish Republic, the United Kingdom, and the cessation of violence across that disputed border. And by ending that, and with Ireland effectively giving up its claim on the north in exchange for the United Kingdom's promise of offering a border poll should the people in the north decide that they no longer wanted to be in the UK. And now the Americans are saying, to counteract exactly what Trump has been saying and his cronies, that the rest of the politicians in the United States are not going to do it. And this goes back to who's in charge in the United States as well, who actually makes the decisions when it comes to things like trade deals, because it's not just Donald Trump. He has to get approval, does he not?
Oh, absolutely. The treaty-making powers and ratification powers of Congress are of signal importance for the United States in agreeing trade deals. Again, I think it demonstrates another layer of either the colossal ignorance of the willful misleading of the public by Brexiteers, in the way in which this is characterised. With the backstop as well, there's another bizarre paradox. Brexiteers would say that it's unnecessary because it would be superseded by a technological solution. In that case, then, why would they be concerned of its presence if it's going to be
if it was such an easy thing for them to solve, then they shouldn't be afraid of it.
Exactly, but they still don't want it, which suggests that they don't believe there'd be there is this magical technical solution. I think more broadly, the attitude in terms of their understanding of US politics, I think it speaks to wishful thinking. Ireland is a small. We regularly now discuss the way in which Ireland has experienced solidarity from all of the European Union member countries and from the EU institutions, and the Commission and negotiators who haven't buckled to British demands. But Ireland equally has a very powerful influence within the United States.
Indeed, many families in politics are descended from Irish migrants. Well, and at least the Kennedys automatically spring to mind when you think of American politicians.
Well, indeed, it's estimated that in terms of the sort of post mid-19th century migrations, as many as 40 million Americans claim Irish ancestry. They have a very powerful place, and of course, American politicians at Senate and President executive level took a very key role in the Good Friday process, and I think that again there's probably a greater sensitivity to just what an achievement that was in 1998 and the delicacy of it and how precarious it could be.
And I think there are other politicians in the UK who we forget actually had a sort of pivotal role in that. Not least of them was John Major, one of probably the better Conservative leaders that have been seen in the UK. What I was going to mention at this point is that, well, two things to do with the Americans' attitude to the Good Friday Agreement. One is that the Good Friday Agreement is seen as a peace treaty, ending a war, effectively, because it was an insurgency. It was an armed struggle. And they are concerned that the United Kingdom, by creating a border across Ireland again, by Brexiting, is it's basically just going to restart a war. Basically, that's it. Just because a few people in England decide they don't like Europe, Ireland has to have a battle going on. And this is obviously why the Americans are concerned. And also, they're saying here that unlike what John Bolton was saying about doing a sector-by-sector deal, in other words, picking and choosing and cherry-picking bits and pieces of a deal that the UK could get from the United States, the Senate and the House of Representatives are saying that an overall trade deal would be extremely difficult to negotiate because so many industries in the US would be affected, and most of them would be resistant to it. They wouldn't want it. And so this, I always, whenever I hear the idea of a sector-by-sector anything, I think about how the Tories tend to break things up into little pieces and try and negotiate a bit here and a bit there, and this just strikes me as being piecemeal. It's not a trade deal. It's a series of miniature deals on different industries. Hardly replaces the European Union.
Yeah, I don't think John Bolton and indeed the Trump administration agenda, however much some of the sort of Tory mid-Atlantists may like to think, is about creating some Anglosphere and a sort of recalibration of the world order. Trump's agenda, Bolton's agenda, is actually similar to Putin's. It's about breaking up multilateral organisations because they're seen as undermining US power. Bolton hates the UN, he hates the EU, he's against these organisations because they can stand up and parley as an equal to the United States. And the reality is, for small countries like Scotland and Ireland and Denmark, there's always been a keen awareness of the need, in the post-war era, of the need to work together. The UK eventually came to that understanding in 1973 when it eventually joined, of the need to actually work and collaborate with other countries. That particular understanding seems to have disappeared. The reality is, for the UK, just as it would be for Germany or France and indeed Italy and other countries, is that they will never be able to go and stand, go shoulder to shoulder with the United States or China or in the coming years.
Not on their own, of course
India,
not.
Of course not. And that's it's obvious. It's not a
this is the
detailed.
Point of the EU, it's a trading bloc.
Exactly, but as the EU, as an entity, it's a trading and regulatory superpower. It can parlay as an equal with China, with the United States. So, of course, and other countries would seek to undermine it on that basis. I think within some of the UK, of those who have advocated leave within the UK and within the UK government, there is frankly a completely sort of deluded view of what the UK's position would be, because it won't just be competing against these superpowers, these economic superpowers. There's the rise of many of the other countries, or Indonesia, Japan, Brazil, exactly as well. So ultimately, the UK is not going to gain any autonomy from the EU. It's just going to go and have to pick another, trading bloc or nation to effectively to whose orbit to enter, and that's not fully been explored or discussed. And it's frustrating now because the whole nature of the Brexit debate has, I think, went beyond any sort of rational discourse. It's become, I suppose, a kind of leading example of identity politics. Perhaps, not in the sort of in Europe and North America. Certainly, one of the leading examples. There was a time, perhaps, when people who had different views about the UK's relationship with Europe would engage in conversation about that and what they would perceive as the relative merits. Now it's someone is a Remainer or they are a Leaver, and to attack any of these ideas is not just to attack the ideas in the abstract, it's to attack the individual.
But it is a strategy by the Leave campaign, if you want, to polarise opinion, turn people on each other, either with us or against us.
Indeed, and it's the final point I was going to make is when we actually look at the polling of Leave voters and we look at the polling of Conservative voters, they're quite happy to see Northern Ireland thrown under the bus. For the Conservative and Unionist Party, majority of members would be quite happy for Scotland to become independent, and that just shows where they are acting against their own supposed values and interests.
Can I'm sorry to stop you there for the moment, Tom, but we need to move on. I'm afraid we've got a lot to get through here tonight. Our next item Our next item of news concerns the SNP's call for answers after Liz Truss was caught red-handed peddling, and I'm quoting here, intentionally misleading assertions. Now, perhaps you can fill us in a little bit on what exactly Liz Truss was asserting and why it was intentionally misleading. What was it she was saying that angered the SNP so much?
This all pertains to the fiscal framework, which was established following the devolution of new tax powers to Scotland, following the Scotland Act in 2016. And so we now have a range of powers. By far the biggest tax power is over income tax. But there's also significant powers over social security spending, which are going to increase vastly next year. Now, in terms of the money that's available for both the Scottish Government expects to raise and to spend, it's based upon forecasts as any other. But the way in which this particular complex set of mechanisms work, it's not just one set of forecasts, it's forecasts between the Scottish Fiscal Commission and the OBR. Now, I've not even started to go into the details, but you start to get a sense that this becomes very, very, very complicated. What has been really happening at the moment is for politicians who wish to go and attack the Scottish Government, it's very easy at the moment just to go and make up numbers and to make up fingers and to try.
They can conflate things. There's lots of scope for that, for confusion.
So essentially what Liz Truss attempted to do was to suggest that there was a huge fiscal transfer that was taking place between from Whitehall to Edinburgh, when in fact what it was about readjustments of forecasts that had been made previously. But this goes back to the whole sort of a broader debate that's taking place within Scottish politics about the fiscal framework, about how Scotland's tax powers are governed. And one of the key issues, and I've had this in conversations at committee level and with colleagues and with a range of different stakeholders, is how opaque it is. And the Scottish Government and the Parliament will engage in this as well. Will be in a process of reviewing the fiscal framework in the coming year or so ahead of 2021. And there's going to be a lot of questions that are going to have to be fully explored within this, not least of which how opaque this system is, where, for example, Scottish income tax in a takes can go up, but the amount available to spend can go down at the same time. So it's very complicated, and it's not something that's easy to go and sort of boil down into a few simple descriptions.
I think probably that the Conservatives particularly like to capitalise on this and use it to sow a bit of confusion among the public and give an impression which is basically simplifications or slightly misrepresenting something without giving an explanation of how it was calculated. They're just arriving at making an assertion like that.
Ultimately, the way the Scottish budget process works is that the Scottish Fiscal Commission will make a forecast, as will the OBR, upon what the block grant adjustment mechanism will be. That is the money the Scottish Government have to spend. But ultimately, once all the data's in, then you look at how much money was actually raised compared to what the forecast was, and there then has to be a reconciliation. If you raise more money than you spent forecast, your quid's in.
Yeah, so it's a little bit like when you're paying your bills in advance, you might not have used as much power or gas or whatever it was as you had been expecting, and there needs to be a readjustment.
That's it. And so there's powers within the fiscal framework. There's borrowing powers. There's also something called the Scotland Reserve, where money can be set aside for these purposes to deal with these particular forecasts. But it's a complicated area, and I think it's incumbent upon all MSPs and politicians in Scotland to actually have a more mature conversation about it, because the converse of the argument we get from the Tories, which is if there's a forecast error and it's out and it suggests that the forecast was for a greater intake of tax than was actually received, then it will be an accusation of a black hole in the budget. But equally, if money's set aside and put in the Scotland Reserve to deal with forecast error and also just to deal with any exceptional spending requirements to come up, then it's not uncommon to find Labour politicians and others saying that this money hasn't been spent, it's been kept down the back of the sofa. So it's often with this particular issue, it can be it's very difficult to actually go and at the moment have a kind of serious grown-up conversation, because it's a new set of powers, and opposition politicians just want to get in and go and make a political point, regardless of how far from the truth it is. And so you'll find independent experts and Fraser Valander and others just banging their head off a desk, quite frankly, because of the amount of nonsense and spin that's actually.
And eventually, of course, I mean, if Scotland was an independent country, none of this nonsense would be necessary. We would be able to collate our own results, and everybody would know the facts.
Yeah,
instead of it being muddied like this.
Yeah, absolutely. It is a complicated, opaque, and messy area, and there's significant questions that pertain to whether the borrowing and reserve powers are sufficient given what forecast errors could be. Well, and there's also a broader issue as well, is that one of the key drivers of economic growth in Scotland is going to be inward migration, and we don't have powers.
Well, hopefully with a little bit of luck, we will not have to be hobbled in this way for much longer.
Well,
we will shortly be independent and not have to put up with this.
Well, if we look at opinion polls, it suggests that the majority of people in Scotland now take that view.
Something a little simpler to get a grip on here, Tom. These are the productivity statistics for Scotland for this year, and they've just been published. These are the official statistics published for Scotland, and the general trend here is upwards. It seems that in the first quarter, productivity in Scotland had increased by 1.1% in real terms, and that was adjusted for inflation compared to the same quarter last year. So we're seeing the labour force in Scotland working harder than ever, it seems, and producing more per capita than last year. And also we're looking at the previous quarter. The productivity was estimated to have grown by 0.4% in first quarter, following growth of 0.2% the previous quarter. So it's been on an ascending curve here. So it looks as if production and productivity in Scotland really is on an upward trend now.
Yeah, we've seen a long-term trend in Scotland of improving productivity. But like so many other positive economic indicators, that's something that could be under threat from Brexit. One of the key areas that can drive productivity is businesses adopting new technologies, new innovative practices. But if businesses are going to be sitting and deferring investment because of uncertainty around Brexit, then they might be less likely to uptake those particular advances, whereas competitors elsewhere in Europe and around the world could. So while it's welcome and it's a positive to see, and I hope we of course all we want it to continue, and it's something that's very important with regards to the fiscal framework we spoke about, because ultimately the heart of that is relative economic performance between Scotland and the rest of the UK. It's another area where, for example, that progress could be under threat as a consequence of Brexit, which is why we have to at all costs avoid a no-deal Brexit and actually do the sensible thing, which is to remain within the European Union. Okay,
well let's leave the subject of productivity there just now, Tom, and move on to our next item. Now this is actually to do with the population of Scotland as it was measured in 2018, and this comes from the National Records of Scotland, and what it's showing, according to this, we've got quite a lot of slides to come up. Now, my notes here don't necessarily correspond exactly with these slides. But what we can see is that Scotland's population continues to increase. And it's at its highest ever at 5.44 million. Migration is the main driver of Scotland's population growth, according to the statistics. However, the rate of population growth has slowed for the second year running. So although migration is helping to mitigate the drop in population, the rise in population is slowing down. Do you think this is perhaps the result of this so-called hostile environment that
I think it certainly could be a contributing factor. Scotland's population growth is becoming reliant upon now from inward migration, and the actions of the UK government, both with regard to the hostile environment, but also the general tone and message that is sent out by their very aggressive stance towards Europe in the whole Brexit process, would naturally dissuade people from choosing to come and live in Scotland or any other part of the UK. and would perhaps encourage people who are already here to perhaps move back to where they originally came from, and that's deeply, deeply concerning. The Scottish government does not have powers over migration, but we certainly see a government that's committed to promoting Scotland as a very positive, outward-looking and inviting country. And I think, where we can continue to do that, the challenge that we face in Scotland with an ageing population is to grow our working age population, and while we can look towards all measures possible.
Okay. I'm sorry to interrupt you there, Tom. We're going to try and move through the various slides that we have that illustrate this. The first one here that we can see shows the growth in population in the upper graph there, and you can see a very steep rise actually towards the end. The annual population growth percentage is dropping, though. We can see that it's dropped to 0.25%, so the rate at which it's growing has dropped. And hopefully we'll see the next slide in a moment, which I hope we can see there. Okay, and this is how migration has driven Scotland's population growth. The natural change, I'm guessing that this is to do with the death rate versus the birth rate, we can see is on a steady decline. But the net migration as it crosses the graph is on an upward trend. But there's been a dip. You can see at the end, the right-hand side of both graphs there, that there is a descending curve there. So something is happening. Something is happening, and it's actually quite a nice, simple graph. I can read that quite easily, even from far away on my monitor.
It'll be very interesting to.
So we seem to be depending a lot on migration.
We are depending
in order to have enough working age people.
Yeah, but Scotland has experienced a phenomena that's not unique to Scotland, which is of a declining sort of natural fertility. And there's a number of reasons behind that have been speculated upon. People are having less children, people are waiting later to have children in life, and there's many positive drivers behind that. But for Scotland and for the viability of our economy and our public services, we need to increase our working age population. And if we don't do that, that is going to present some incredibly challenging problems, which will have significant consequences.
I personally have thought for a long time that with the population of my generation living longer, that the health service is going to become far more of a necessity, and it has to grow in order to cope with the increased demand. And I would have thought, despite the fact that might sound like a downside, it's going to provide thousands of jobs for medics over the next decades.
Well, one of the key growth areas, of course, is going to be in social care. And that is a sector we know we have challenges in attracting people into. And we have a large number of people who come from the European Union who work in that sector. And it's another sector that's particularly exposed to a hard Brexit.
We can see now, actually, on the screen, our viewers will be able to see this, that most of Scotland's population growth has come from migration. And we can see a figure there for compared to other countries. We can see within the UK that England's population, its natural change is on a downward slope, and a lot of it, you can see almost half there is growth from migration. In Scotland, we're looking at a much bigger percentage in terms of migration. It's far more important to us. That grey area is what we need to maintain our population. We have to have migration.
Absolutely.
Either that or everybody has to have far more children.
Indeed, and that presents all sorts of other challenges as well.
It would, yes.
So I would just reiterate, it's fundamental. Migration has been an incredible positive for Scotland, but for our public services, for our private sector, for our economy, it's vital, and particularly for some of our rural communities which are at risk of depopulation. An end to inward migration could become an existential issue. So this is fundamental importance to all Scotland, rural and urban, private and public sector.
There's one thing here, I'm talking about the birth rates, and Scotland's total fertility rate apparently is the lowest in the UK, and that surprised me, I must admit, and it's falling at a faster rate than all the other UK countries. There surely must be some explanation for this, but nobody seems to be venturing what it is. All we see is that the birth rate is falling and fertility rates are declining.
Yeah, I can't, obviously I'm not qualified to make a technical statement on that particular matter, but it is, as I previously suggested, it's a phenomenon that is not unique to Scotland. Perhaps it's more accentuated in Scotland, but we are seeing it in many countries around the globe, of advanced, developed countries for that matter, that with increased opportunities, people are perhaps deferring having a family, or getting married later, or they're having less children, or maybe choosing not to have children at all.
It also seems that the life expectancy of people in Scotland is the life expectancy is pretty much flatlined, and we have also got on the screen at the moment the death rate in Scotland at the moment, and we're looking at the two different figures here. One is the actual number of deaths, 58,000, which is a minus 1%, and the age standardised mortality rate. Now, I'm not really sure how that is arrived at, but I think we can see that the death rate is pretty much level. I mean, it seems to be going along a straight line. So the death rate has stabilised, but the birth rate has fallen.
Obviously, there's
apparently, yeah, I've just been hearing that the death rate had been dropping, but it's stopped doing that now.
Yes.
So medical science seems to have reached a kind of plateau. It can't get us to live any longer.
This is something I know National Records and NHS Health Scotland will be looking at, because we have to understand why this would be the case. But one of the things we may come to in a moment is the variation in life expectancy and healthy life expectancy between the most affluent and the most deprived areas.
Yes.
So there's a set of interconnected reasons. So medical science and technology is advancing, which is enabling individuals to live a longer and healthier lives. However, we know that as a consequence of poverty, as a consequence of UK government austerity, that in some communities that can mitigate against those advances and can actually lead to people having a shorter healthy life expectancies. Just
along the lines of what you've been talking about, Tom, here we can see the graph now showing that how deprivation has a very strong effect on life expectancy in Scottish people. And the graph shows quite clearly there a decline in terms of as deprivation increases, life expectancy drops away sharply. Scotland has the lowest life expectancy of all UK countries, and here they are all compared actually in a row, one after the other. You can see Scotland, the blue line, lying below the curve. So there has to be some reason, fundamental reason, why Scotland is lagging so far behind. I know it's not a competition, but I imagine that there must be a number of environmental issues, if nothing else, that people have had a harder life, they've subjected to more deprivation, they've had less nutritious food, they've had perhaps more problems with addictions or alcohol or tobacco. Whatever it is, poor people tend to suffer more than others, and their life expectancy and their life qualities generally.
Absolutely, and I think this is an area that requires further study and exploration, and I look forward to that work being undertaken. One thing I would be interested to see would be to see a regional breakdown within the rest of the UK, because I imagine within, for example, England alone, there will be considerable variation between perhaps some of the home counties in life expectancy, and perhaps some areas in the Midlands of the North, particularly post-industrial areas.
The industrial North will probably have similar statistics to our own.
And to some extent, when we look at figures representing the rest of the UK or England, sometimes because of the particular affluence, they can artificially inflate the whole figure. Now, I'm speculating here, but it would be interesting to see.
It's so easy to generalise about things. We're looking here primarily at the Scottish figures. But as you say, seeing those in a vacuum without anything to compare them to, we have seen the comparison with the rest of the UK's things like life expectancy. We can compare them, but they track parallel at a lower level for some reason. It could be historical. It could be that the generations currently living were subjected to far more deprivation than others, and therefore we have to see that generation out before we'll see a change. Migration, we have a graph on screen at the moment. It says nowadays more people come to Scotland than leave, although the difference has narrowed in recent years. And again, at the end of the graph, we see a dip there. And this seems to correspond virtually with the beginning of Brexit and the imposition of this hostile environment, as it's called. Do you think, considering this hostile environment that's been introduced, we will see more migration, perhaps from south of the border? If it's so hard to find young workers from abroad, perhaps more people will be tempted to Scotland from other parts of the UK.
I think that's certainly a possibility. I know for many people in England, the social contract that's an offer in Scotland, free personal care for the elderly, you're not having to pay for your prescription charges, etc., free university education if you're a Scottish resident student, they're very attractive. And I think for perhaps many people in England and the rest of the UK who are disillusioned at what they see, Scotland can seem as a progressive beacon which they would seek to migrate towards. I think as well one of the challenges we're always going to face, and all countries are going to face, is in a globalised world, people can become far more mobile. If you're fortunate enough to be born in Scotland and go through the Scottish education system and come out qualified as a teacher, as an engineer, or as a clinician, then you could potentially go and work anywhere in the world. And historically, as a people, Scotland have always been outward looking, and we have a huge Scottish diaspora going back for hundreds and hundreds of years, first into Eastern Europe and then over to North America and the Commonwealth.
We can actually see a graph here which shows the makeup of the migrants who come to Scotland and where they come from. And we can see the group from the EU, and we can see, I'm not sure, EU 14. I'll need to get that explained to me what that means. But we also have non-EU, rest of the world, and Asia. So there is a large number of people from the European Union, a fantastically large number. Almost, well, it's more than the rest of the world put together when you look at these graphs. So obviously the Brexit is really going to hurt this, if it hasn't already.
Absolutely, and Scotland historically it was very interconnected with Europe, particularly in the sort of early modern Scotland and up until the Act of Union. After that, there was obviously a lot of migration outward of Scotland to North America, and then in the post-war era, there was a huge inward immigration from the former empire. And
here we can see it here on our own screen in the studio, Tom, that most of the vast majority of influx to Scotland was from Poland. The Republic of Ireland, Lithuania, Italy and France. That's quite a remarkable figure for Poland. I mean, I knew there was quite a large Polish community in Scotland, particularly in Glasgow there's a large Polish community, but I really didn't know that it was as large as that.
Yeah.
That's quite astonishing. You imagine, because, well, when you live in somewhere like Glasgow in the west of Scotland, you imagine there would be a large Pakistani and Indian component to that, but when we see the figures there, actually, the European part of it is far larger.
Absolutely. And every single EU citizen who has come to Scotland has made an enormous positive contribution, both economically and culturally. And, I have a flourishing Polish community in my own constituency, as I know many of my colleagues do in theirs. And I think, what's been very commendable in terms of how the Scottish Government have responded to Brexit is making absolutely clear, abundantly clear, that all EU citizens who come to Scotland, Scotland is your home, you're welcome here, you're as Scottish as you or I, and you have made an enormous contribution and we want you to stay, and we want more people to come and live and work in Scotland.
Well, this is another interesting statistic here, which I hope we can see, is the number of marriages in Scotland has continued to fall. Marriage seems to have fallen out of fashion. I'm not sure if you can venture an opinion on this one, Tom. As a married man myself, of 33 years now, to me marriage is a sort of normal state to be. Although I'm not so old-fashioned that I would object to either one of my children not marrying, but it does seem like there's been a massive drop-off. I don't know what the explanation is for this, whether it's just fashion, social trends, or...
Again, it's I imagine there's a lot of complicated factors at play. The decline of the influence of the church in Scotland, the number of people who consider themselves as religious could play a part in that. There's also the fact that people can be deferring getting married to later in life, or we don't see the same need for it. There was a generation before. In the post-war era, where there was a stigma, perhaps, of not being married.
But of course, if you were a married
couple,
couple, you had tax benefits which other people didn't have.
Indeed.
Which have now been adjusted so that same-sex couples and couples who are not married have similar rights. So you have civil partnerships. We can even see this on the screen now as well, that civil partnerships also have decreased since same-sex marriage was introduced. So marriage for same-sex couples is becoming more popular, and yet living together is not so popular. It's like an exact opposite of the heterosexual community's trending.
Yeah. I think it's fascinating. I think if these figures were to have been forecast 30 or 40 years ago, no one would have believed it possible, and I think it's testament to probably I think has a great deal to do with Scotland becoming a more open, tolerant and liberal society where people feel comfortable to live the lives that they want to lead.
Maybe now, though, that if you pardon the expression, the honeymoon is now over, because the figures that we're seeing, although there was a steep climb in the occurrences of same-sex marriage, we can see there's then been a steep decline and then a levelling out, roughly, just a little bit, down to about 60% of its high water mark there. So perhaps now the novelty has worn off and people now have a more settled sort of attitude to same-sex marriage. It's become more normal. There must have been queues of people waiting for the legislation, perhaps, that have produced a big spike in the figures.
Well, I can imagine certainly that, and it is just speculation, but when Scotland introduced equal marriage, there would have been something that for many people who weren't able to go and enjoy that right, that was, for many of that was something they would have not been able to dream about even a decade or so.
So there must have been an enormous backlog of people just waiting for the
potentially day. It would be fascinating to see the research and study into to explain why there's that particular initial peak, and perhaps where we are now is what would be regarded as a sort of normal trend.
Well, I'm being told by the team that the next slide we've got is actually on adoptions, and hopefully we'll be able to see that slide more closely here. Now, this is an interesting one. There's a double peak in this graph. So adoptions have decreased to 471 in 2018 from, I think the high point looks like around about the 1994? My eyesight's not that great. Maybe 1946 was the first peak, and then there's a peak at 1967 and another one at 1974, and then we see a steady drop and gradual decline in the number of adoptions. Now I'm wondering, as a child of the 1960s, whether there might not have been a large number of orphans after World War II who needed to be adopted. But what puzzles me is why there were so many in the 1960s.
That's an interesting question. Again,
the pill, of course, somebody just said to me there,
it was
made a difference to that.
There would have been there was a huge liberalisation of society that it took place, and then there may have been for some that felt adoption was more. I don't know if it was perhaps seen as more. If ever was a simplification of process, or that it was seen that it was something that was more acceptable, or more children were put up for adoption. I don't know,
but it would be interesting
to see
the attitudes changed to single parenthood as well. That it became more acceptable, and therefore more maybe young women or even men would look after a child where normally that child might have been put up for adoption in the past.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, we've also got a census here of the number of households in the country at the moment. And again, we can see a steady but slow increase. And this next slide gives us a bit of a breakdown on the number of different types of households we have in Scotland. So we've got a high point in 2017 of living alone in small households of one person. And a slow but steady increase to 851 of two-person households. And then, what's this? Three-person households, or I guess families, have been bumping along the bottom a little bit, really, in terms of the numbers of them, and they're slightly lower than they were back in the early 2000s. Now, this is an interesting one because I think this shows perhaps something in Scotland that we should be a little bit more proud of, and that's the number of homes that are actually occupied. And you can see from this graph that 96% of all the homes in Scotland are actually occupied.
That's
okay, so we've got 83,400 homes that are currently empty. Why they're empty, well, I don't know. I guess that's just a statistic at the moment. That would need to be examined more closely. And the number of second homes, 25,000, which is just 1% of the total. Which I think is encouraging because it means, how many people need a second home? How many people can afford a second home?
Indeed, it'll be interesting to see how that trend develops, given the Scottish Government introduced the additional dwelling supplement, an additional tax on second homes, which I think we can understand as having a policy intent beyond just revenue raising, which is to ensure the availability of homes for people in Scotland and to support young people getting onto the property ladder.
Yeah, I wonder actually if the 1% figure for second homes actually accurately reflects the fact that 1% of the population are the wealthiest. And perhaps that's the simplest explanation.
It would be interesting to do a deep dive. It'd be interesting to know how many second homes are owned by people who are normally resident in Scotland.
Well, we need to move on. Time is pressing, so we'll crack on with the next two items. Now, this one is a new face with new ideas. This is Tom Mills, the candidate for the Shetland by-election. And I know Nicola Sturgeon was on a ferry this morning. I saw some photographs of her on social media heading up there. And so the First Minister has described Mr Wills as a standout candidate of the by-election and said he would be a great asset. Now, I remember from last week reading that this man is a family man, he's a young fellow, he works in the oil industry offshore, and he's a native Shetlander as well. So he seems to represent a demographic which, well, Scotland needs this kind of person. And he's obviously, well, being a family man, he understands more than anybody else the needs of a growing family. Do you think that gives him an advantage in this particular by-election? I don't know really what his opposition is here. I
don't know Tom personally. I'm hoping to get up to Shetland at some point before the by-election to support his campaign. But I've been hugely impressed following the campaign in social media and the general media as well. I think it's if you look at Shetland as a state, it's been historically held by the Liberal Democrats almost continuously for I think the last century and a half, certainly the last 70 years. And I think the message that Tom is putting out, which is to give him a chance, give him 18 months to show what he can do. And then we've got an opportunity for people in Shetland, as across Scotland, to cast their votes again for the Scottish Parliament election in 2021 is very powerful. And I think as well, it's always very encouraging to see people from our island communities who are committing and putting down roots there. And we spoke earlier about risks of rural depopulation. So if they have young people setting up roots there and to work in there and then wanting to go and represent and build their and strengthen their communities.
I imagine for a young man like this to become an MP would be a huge wrench away from the islands for him. Also, perhaps a massive change for his family if he is elected.
Well, certainly, I'm represent a constituency which is only about 50 miles from Edinburgh, but given the work and responsibilities I have, and often the fact that Parliament may, stop, the debates may stop at 5 o'clock or just afterwards, that there's events going on into the evening and meetings to be held, etc. So it is a wrench, and I think it's something that's often perhaps, unless you're directly involved in politics, it can be often missed. Which is for those who go into politics and those who commit and do the job properly, they're working long hours and long hours away from their family as well, and that can create it creates a lot of challenges. And I know it's something there's been a lot of commentary on about the impact that has and how upon mental health, about family life and relationships.
Like that is obviously going to need an extended family to help out with children and the chores and all kinds of different things.
So I'm sure that's something that anyone who goes forward as a candidate, particularly who are going to be a high-profile candidate in the by-election, takes into consideration. And it's great to see the sort of energy and the work that's gone into that campaign. campaign. It's great to see as well the youth wing of the SNP, the YSI, who've been putting in a hell of a shift up there regularly. So it's great to see a young, enthusiastic candidate being backed by young and enthusiastic members of the party as well.
It's not long now till the election, the 29th of August. I'm just going to read out the candidates for the other parties to make sure that we're fair here. Councillor Johan Adamson is Labour's candidate, while Bryden Goodlad and Tom Wills are the respective Scottish Conservatives and SNP representatives on the list. The Scottish Liberal Democrats have chosen the Shetland Islands Council Deputy Convener, Beatrice Wishart, to contest the by-election. And also in the contest are Stuart Martin for UKIP, 3 independent candidates, and Michael Stout, Peter Tate and Ryan Thompson, and Ian Scott, who has no party listed. Now this is the end of that story for the time being. And now we're moving abroad now, taking us away from Scotland, and almost as far away as you could get really, to Kashmir. And the problems engulfing particularly the Indian-administered part of the disputed territory of Kashmir this week. According to, quoting from The Guardian here, just so that the Guardian readers know that we don't, we always try to acknowledge our news sources. The Guardian says here that Indian-administered Kashmir will remain under strictly enforced curfew on Thursday as India marks its Independence Day, and it's a date usually accompanied by protests in the disputed state. So they're obviously worried that there is going to be some blowback from the clampdown and the blackout of social media, television and radio. What do you make of this? Why do you think India has gone to such lengths to damp down this area? They must have been expecting something to happen. I've never seen actually a very good or convincing explanation for why they took this action.
Yeah, I must confess, my understandings of what the sort of longer-term strategic motivations of the Indian government are not entirely clear to me. However, it is clearly concerning, I think, for those not just within Kashmir and India and Pakistan and the wider region, but for the world, that we have a potential period of escalating tension between two nuclear-armed powers. And that is a concern, because there's always the danger for escalation, misunderstanding. I'm not suggesting about that anywhere near that stance.
Do you think this is perhaps India moving to annex their part of Kashmir and actually trying to solidify the border so that the disputed territory is no longer so much disputed that they are basically going to carve it in two? A little bit like Berlin was carved in two after World War II. It's beginning to look this way. I'm just going to have read a little bit of the response here from Imran Khan, who is of course the Pakistani Prime Minister, former cricketer. And he's saying he's expected to make a speech in the Legislative Assembly denouncing what he claims is India's violation of international law. He's vowed to lobby the heads of state over what he says are illegal actions by the Indian government, and though the response so far has been muted. Now, Pakistan has sought to internationalise the Kashmir dispute. Now, they have wanted some kind of resolution to this dispute for years with India, and India has always refused to go to any kind of mediation over this.
I think that's a very important point, and again, it's an element of speculation, but the changing international picture, where you have in the White House someone who's very much into Donald Trump, whose concern is primarily with bilateral relationships, with the rise of China and a very authoritarian vision. And it's interesting, the analogous situation in Hong Kong at the moment, where a nominally autonomous territory is perhaps is under
they want
threat.
To cement it. So that it's beyond doubt.
But I think the climate that we exist in at the moment, where we see multilateral agreements such as the Iran nuclear deal being, or
just torn up,
Paris, but climate again, Trump that pulling out, that emboldens
the Paris Climate Accord as well, being torn up by the Americans.
So for those other leaders in other countries who perhaps have looked for opportunities to exploit that changing climate in
so do you feel maybe that
diplomacy.
Trump has been a bit of a cheerleader, and they've now taken this as a sort of starting pistol for them to take similar actions?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily. I'm couldn't draw a direct correlation, but I think in terms of the changing international environment, and a move towards seeking to normalise these kind of more aggressive and assertive actions, it risks emboldening a more aggressive postures from other countries if the world's only superpower is willing to adopt the sort of policies and positions that it is at the moment. And clearly, there's deep concern also, just as I made reference to there, in Hong Kong, currently, given I think we're into 9 or 10 weeks of protest, and the pressure that's going to be put upon the Hong Kong executive in Beijing to bring these protests to an end. And again, there's a danger there for the situation to escalate that could have very significant consequences and ramifications. And the more events like that happen, such as an assertive India and Kashmir, an assertive China and Hong Kong, that again starts to normalise a type of more aggressive politics that we had hoped we had put to bed a generation ago.
The leaders of Kashmir themselves have basically said that they've given up any hope now of returning to the status that they had before, where it's effectively self-governing with India's assistance, shall we say, and Pakistan assisting in their sector. But now they're saying that because Delhi has basically destroyed any remaining trust in mainstream politics, the people feel they've got no other choice now but to resist this in some way, which leads me to think that it may not be a war that's going to start over this, but it might be an internal war inside Kashmir between two factions inside the disputed territory itself. And it's beginning to sound more and more like a kind of Indian Northern Ireland, if you pardon the sort of parallel in the drawing here. You know, you're carving a country in two, basically, and two other countries are fighting over ownership of this patch of land between the two of them, and the people who live there are basically just pawns in the game. Anyway, I think we'll leave that now. We have just one last item. We're overrunning a little bit, but I wanted to end on a positive note. And you can't fail to have seen the young 16-year-old activist Greta Thunberg as she set sail for New York from Plymouth this afternoon. And I personally find this young lady to be probably one of the most influential and inspirational young people that I have ever seen, actually. And for a girl who has Asperger's syndrome, to come out this way and to do something like this is extremely brave, because I know that young people with Asperger's syndrome often see things with a clarity that other people do not. They also have a laser-like attention to detail, and from my experience, they don't take any rubbish from anybody. And Greta Thunberg has basically taught the politicians a lesson. She has talked down to them in their own in their own parliaments and told them what they should do. And she has a massive following all over the world. And I think even yesterday in Kabul, there were reports of a children's march down the streets of Kabul after there had been a massive truck bomb. There were hundreds of youngsters with placards marching down the streets of Kabul. I can't remember a time when children have had to talk to adults in this way and tell us what to do.
Yes, I agree entirely that it's a very inspirational figure. I think what's also telling is not just the people she inspires, but the people in whom she provokes ire and anger. And I think some of the ways some commentators and figures on both sides of the Atlantic have behaved in their remarks show that they see that laser-like precision and clarity that you spoke of as a threat. Because there are those who, if we are to address the climate emergency, not just here in Scotland or the UK or in Europe, across the world, that is going to mean very significant changes, and there's a lot of vested interests are going to oppose that. And any figure who can, with clarity, articulate what the issues are and what needs to be done, and particularly someone who can do it with such simplicity, and can show that it's not complicated, if we could forgive the expression, if a child of a young person can understand it and can communicate, then that person represents a threat to a lot of these vested interests. Hence the sort of bile that's been poured against her. But I think that just goes to show how effective she has been in her campaigning, both in inspiring people and in frightening others.
I Atlantic in the middle of the kind of weather we've just had, on principle like this, is a remarkable gesture. Not just a gesture, it's a sort of demonstration of her commitment. And she was saying this afternoon that after she's addressed this climate conference in New York, she doesn't even know how she's going to get home. She's going to have to hitch a ride on some other surface transport. And yet I bet you there are queues of people waiting at the docks to take her back.
I imagine there will be, and I certainly think it's a huge challenge. One certainly beyond what I would ever contemplate to cross the Atlantic in a racing yacht. But I feel the bigger challenge will be when she arrives in the United States and trying to persuade some of the key decision makers of not just the validity of her concerns, but of the need to act and the need to act now. And that is a challenge that we all face, because for whatever action we take here in Scotland, it's going to require a global effort. So I hope that she is successful where others have failed in attempting to persuade Mr. Trump and his acolytes of the need to take action now.
Okay. Well, listen, thank you very much for all of your help this evening, Tom, with the show. I'm sorry we got off to a rather shaky start at the beginning. But that's it for tonight, everybody. We'll be back again tomorrow night when Kenny will be presenting the show. I'm going to take a little bit of a break, as normally, as you know, I present the Thursday edition. But I'll be back next week on Monday. But from all of us here at Broadcasting Scotland, and before I go, just let me remind you that producing these programmes is expensive, and to allow us to continue to make these programmes for you and to pay the bills to run the studio, we need more people to sign up to Broadcasting Scotland as supporters. Now, your £5 a month will help us to continue, so please sign up on our website, www.broadcastingscotland.scot/register. And from all of us here at Broadcasting Scotland this evening and the Scotland at 7 team, a very good night to you.